The wind was a living thing. It came screaming down from the jagged teeth of the mountains, a starving predator, whose howl was the sound of winter's own heartless hunger. It clawed at the farmhouse, its invisible talons tearing at the brittle wooden slats that Henry, with his own 2 hands, had painstakingly nailed into place. This was no mere storm, it was a reckoning. The kind of tempest that ripped fence posts from the frozen earth, as if they were loose teeth, and scoured the very skin raw with its icy breath and payload of grit. Above the vast, unforgiving plains, slate-gray clouds stacked one upon the other, a bruised and heavy ceiling pressing down on the world. The air itself seemed to shiver, charged with a violent, electric tension. The wild prairie, once a boundless sea of golden grass that had whispered promises to Leia on summer evenings, had transformed into a churning battleground of wind, mud, and ice. Inside the small, beleaguered house, Leia Carson clutched her daughter, Eliza, so tightly it was hard to tell where one body ended and the other began. The girl's small frame trembled, a vibration that came not just from the insidious cold seeping through the walls, but from the crackling fear she could feel in the frantic, unsteady rhythm of her mother's heartbeat. Leia's heart was a wild horse, galloping in the tight paddock of her ribs. She pressed her lips to her daughter's temple, tasting the salt of sweat and tears, a bitter communion of their shared terror. Eliza's dark curls, so much like her father's, were damp and plastered against her cheek. "He promised he'd make the walls stronger before winter, Mama," Eliza whispered, her voice a tiny, fragile thing in the roaring chaos. "He promised." "I know, my love. I know," Leia murmured back, her own voice thick with unshed tears. The memory of Henry's promise was a fresh wound. She could see him now, standing right where she was, his brow furrowed in concentration, his hands, calloused and strong, measuring a length of timber. "This house will stand against anything, Leia. For you. For our girl." A lie, as it turned out. The house was failing, and he was gone. Outside, a sound cut through the storm's symphony of destruction, a sound more menacing than any howl of wind, boot heels striking the wooden porch with merciless, rhythmic finality. Leia's blood ran cold. She knew that heavy, unforgiving tread. The door flew open, not from the wind, but from a powerful shove. Amos Granger, her father-in-law, filled the doorway like a thunderhead, a hulking shadow that swallowed the flickering lantern light behind him. His face was a landscape carved from granite, weathered and cracked by decades lived under the harsh western sun. He was a man who saw the world in terms of profit and loss, strength and weakness. There was no room for softness in him, and none dwelt in his eyes now. All Leia could see was a cold, simmering fury that had finally boiled over. "You've brought shame on this house, Leia," Amos said. His voice was not a shout, it was worse. It was a low, splintering sound that cut through the roar of the storm like a shard of ice. "Shame and ruin." Her mouth went dry, a desert of fear. She tried to swallow, but her throat felt as though it had been packed with sand and dust. I never." "Don't you lie to me, girl," he snapped, spitting the word girl like a wad of bitter tobacco. His gaze swept the room, lingering on the small cross she had whittled, the bundle of mountain herbs she had bought from a traveling woman, the last of their coins spent on anything that felt like hope. "Your husband's gone, and you've wasted the last of our coin on foolish hopes. Prayers and trinkets won't fill the silo, and they sure as hell won't bring Henry back." The accusation, so bald and cruel, tore through her like a rusted blade. Henry, her husband, their son, buried under a sudden, monstrous avalanche weeks before, his body still lost somewhere in the white-shrouded silence of the mountains. She hadn't wasted their money. She had done the only things she knew how to do. She had paid for prayers at the distant mission. She had hired 2 grizzled prospectors to search for him until the first snows made it impossible. She had bought herbs from a Ute woman who spoke of poultices that could draw life back from the brink of death. It was not foolish hope, it was the desperate, frantic scrabbling of a wife who refused to let go. But Amos had no patience for grief that wasn't his own, and his grief had long ago curdled into blame. Behind Amos, a second figure materialized from the storm-lashed darkness. Martha Granger, her mother-in-law, stood like a pale, skeletal wraith. Her lips, always thin, were now pressed into a cruel, bloodless line. If Amos was the thunder, Martha was the chilling frost that followed, killing everything it touched. Her eyes, small and hard as river stones, offered no kindness, no flicker of shared loss. In her hands, she held a battered carpet bag, stuffed clumsily with Leia's meager belongings. Without a word, without a single glance at the child who was her granddaughter, she dropped the bag onto the muddy, windswept porch. The soft thud was a sound of absolute finality. Eliza whimpered, her small fingers digging into Leia's sleeve like tiny anchors. "Mama, I'm scared." That small, terrified sound was the spark that ignited the last embers of Leia's defiance. She forced her spine straight, a column of sheer will, though her knees threatened to betray her and send her collapsing to the floor. She would not let Eliza see her fall apart. Not here. Not in front of them. "It's going to be all right, baby," she whispered, the words a lie woven from the strongest threads of love she possessed. She met Amos's glare, her own eyes blazing. "This is my home. Henry built it for me. For us." "Henry is dead," Amos growled, the words a hammer blow. "And this land belongs to the Grangers. You're no Granger. You were a distraction, a weakness that got my son killed. He was up in those mountains looking for that damned fool's gold you filled his head with, instead of being here, mending his own roof." It was another lie, a twisting of the truth so profound it stole her breath. Henry had gone looking for a stray calf, a vital piece of their precarious livelihood. The gold was a dream they had shared in whispers, a sweet what-if for a future that would never come. Amos stepped closer, his presence sucking the very air from the room. He lifted a rust-speckled shotgun, not aiming it, but holding it across his chest as if to underline his command. The metal gleamed dully in the lantern light. "You're no kin to us anymore. Get off our land." The words struck harder than any physical blow. "No kin to us anymore." For a heartbeat, Leia stood frozen, every cell in her body screaming against the sheer, unadulterated cruelty of it. This was Henry's family. The family she had married into, had tried to please, had borne a child for. But the weight of Amos's glare, the relentless fury of the storm outside, and the bone-deep chill that clawed through the cracked walls of the house all told her the same truth: there would be no mercy here. With trembling hands that she willed to be steady, she gathered Eliza into her arms, pulling the girl's hood up over her dark curls. She scooped up the threadbare shawl from the back of a chair and wrapped it around them both. Then, with a dignity she did not feel, she stepped out into the tempest. The cold was a physical assault. It slapped her face, cutting through the thin wool of her shawl like 1,000 tiny knives. Rain, mixed with sharp pellets of ice, pelted her, soaking her skirts to the bone in an instant. The thick, greedy mud of the porch sucked at her worn boots, trying to claim her. The wind ripped the air from her lungs, leaving her gasping. She dared one last glance over her shoulder, a desperate, foolish hope flickering in her shattered heart. But Amos had already slammed the door. The heavy thud echoed the sound of a coffin lid closing. A single bar of wood slid into place on the other side, barring them from the only shelter they had ever known. Her heart didn't just break, it splintered into a million jagged pieces. But she kept moving. She stumbled off the porch, her boots sinking into the mire. She grabbed the handle of the carpet bag. Each step away from the house, each step into the heart of the roaring storm, felt like a march toward oblivion. But with Eliza's life a fragile, warm weight in her arms, she knew she could not stop. She would not. Part 2, The Heart of the Storm. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of sound and fury. Leah staggered under the weight of the carpet bag in one hand, clutching Eliza with the other arm, as the wind battered them relentlessly from all sides. It was a physical enemy, pushing, shoving, trying to tear them apart. The road, usually a familiar ribbon of packed earth, had vanished, swallowed by churning rivers of mud and debris. The gnarled, skeletal trees on the plains bent low, their branches clawing at the tumultuous sky as though they were bowing to some merciless, unseen god. "Mama!" Eliza cried out, her voice nearly stolen by a sudden, vicious gust. The wind tore her bonnet free, sending it cartwheeling into the churning darkness like a lost prayer. Leah saw it for a second, a pale ghost against the grey, and then it was gone. A small thing, but it felt like a monumental loss. "Hold on to me, Eliza. Just hold on." Leah shouted over the din, wrapping her arms tighter around her daughter, trying to shield her with the inadequate warmth of her own body. Where could they go? The nearest town, such as it was, lay 10 miles away, a distance that felt like 100, 1,000 in this inferno of rain and sleet. Their neighbors were scattered homesteaders, most as desperate and weather-beaten as the Grangers, their charity likely as thin as their winter stores. She couldn't imagine any of them risking Amos Granger's wrath to offer sanctuary to a widow and her child cast out in disgrace. The story Amos would tell would be a cruel one, and people in this land were quick to believe the worst. Still, she forced her legs to move. One step. Then another. Then another. It became a mindless, agonizing rhythm. She could not stop. She would not stop. Not with Eliza's life bound so tightly, so inextricably, to her own. The storm seemed to laugh at her pathetic determination, shifting its attack. Sheets of rain began to slash sideways across the open plains, so dense and cold they felt like solid walls of ice. Thunder cracked overhead, a violent, explosive sound that rattled her teeth and seemed to vibrate deep in her bones. And beneath the thunder, a new sound threaded its way through the chaos, a sound that made the fine hairs on her neck stand on end, the high, mournful howl of wolves. They were out there, hunting, their cries weaving through the storm like phantoms. Despair, sharp as hunger pains, gnawed at her resolve. She thought of Henry. She let the memories flood in, using them as fuel against the cold. She thought of his warm, capable hands holding hers. She thought of his gentle eyes, the way they crinkled at the corners when he smiled. She remembered the promises they had made to each other beneath the ancient cottonwood tree by the creek, the summer they were married. Forever, Leah. No matter what. He would have fought Amos. He would have fought the storm. He would have fought the entire world, tooth and nail, to protect their daughter. But Henry was gone. Swallowed by the mountain. And all that remained was Leah's ferocity, a mother's primal, unyielding refusal to let her child perish. Her foot slipped on a patch of slick, muddy clay on a downward slope. She went down hard, twisting her body mid-fall to shield Eliza. She landed with a sickening crunch, her body absorbing the impact. Rocks, hidden beneath the mud, scraped her palms and tore through the thin fabric at her knees. Pain, white-hot and searing, shot up her leg. For a moment, she lay there, the icy mud seeping into her clothes, the rain beating down on her back. The temptation to just stay there, to let the storm take them, was overwhelming. It would be so easy. A quiet surrender. Eliza's small, terrified gasp broke the spell. "Mama?" "I'm here," Leah rasped, the word tearing from her throat. She pushed herself up, ignoring the screaming protest of her muscles and the sharp, grinding pain in her ankle. "Keep going," she muttered, more to herself than to Eliza. "We have to keep going." Minutes, or was it hours, blurred into an endless, agonizing crawl through the tempest. Leah lost all track of time, all sense of direction. There was only the wind, the rain, the mud, and the pain. Exhaustion pulled at her limbs like heavy, invisible chains. But a flicker of fire, stubborn and fierce, burned in the center of her chest. She had endured childbirth on this land. She had fought through droughts that baked the earth to dust and blizzards that buried the world in white. She would not yield to this. It was then that she saw it. A flicker of light. At first, she thought her mind was playing tricks on her, a phantom of hope conjured by a desperate brain. But she blinked the rain from her eyes and looked again. Far across the ridge, impossibly distant, a faint orange glow flickered, a tiny, struggling beacon in the overwhelming dark. Hope, so fierce and bright it was almost painful, flared in her chest. Firelight. A hearth. A lantern. Salvation. "Eliza, look," she whispered, her voice hoarse and cracked. She nudged her daughter's chin, pointing toward the distant flame. "Look, my love." The girl's eyes, wide and glistening with fear and rain, followed her gaze. A tiny spark of life, of wonder, kindled in her expression. "Mama, is that home?" The question was a knife in Leah's heart. She couldn't bear to tell her the truth, that their home was behind them, locked and barred forever. "It's safety," she said instead, the word a promise she prayed to God she could keep. With a new, desperate purpose, she surged forward. She half dragged, half carried Eliza toward that distant, fragile light. Her muscles screamed in protest, her injured ankle sent jolts of agony up her leg with every step, but she refused to stop. The light was a magnet, pulling them onward. Each step brought them closer. Closer to warmth. Closer to life. The terrain grew rougher as they climbed the ridge, a landscape of rock and thorny brush. The wind seemed to fight her harder here, as if trying to keep her from her goal. But the light grew stronger, brighter. It was real. It had to be. They finally crested the ridge, Leia's lungs burning, her body a symphony of pain. Lightning exploded across the sky at that exact moment, a brilliant, terrifying flash that illuminated the entire landscape in stark black and white. And in that flash of divine, cruel light, she saw the source of the glow. It was not a cabin. It was not a lantern on a porch. It was a smoldering tree, an old, mighty oak that had been split down the middle by a recent lightning strike. Flames licked lazily up its twisted, blackened trunk, casting wild, dancing shadows over the desolate landscape. It was a funeral pyre, not a hearth. No cabin. No sanctuary. Only fire and ruin. Leia's heart, which had soared with such desperate hope, sank into the pit of her stomach. The hope drained out of her, leaving a cold, heavy void. The storm roared in what sounded like triumph, a merciless predator savoring its victory. This was it. The end. She had nothing left. Tears, hot and bitter, blurred her vision, mixing with the cold rain on her cheeks. She sank to her knees, the last of her strength finally abandoning her. Despair, complete and absolute, washed over her. But even as her hope faltered, she felt Eliza's small hand squeeze hers. The girl had slid from her arms and was standing beside her, a tiny, defiant figure against the raging storm. "Mama," Eliza whispered, her voice barely audible over the gale, yet clear as a bell in Leia's soul. "Don't stop." A simple plea. A child's command. But it was enough. It was everything. Leia looked from the burning tree to her daughter's face, illuminated by its dying light. She saw the fear there, but she also saw something else, a reflection of her own stubbornness, of Henry's resilience. A spirit that refused to be broken. She swallowed her sorrow, pushing it down deep. She tightened her grip on Eliza's hand. She leaned forward and kissed her daughter's wet forehead, her own lips numb with cold. "We won't stop," she vowed, her voice a ragged, trembling thread of steel. "No matter what." And with that, they turned their backs on the false hope of the burning tree and trudged deeper into the storm, deeper into the unknown. Somewhere ahead, beyond the darkness and the despair, their fate waited to be written. And as Leia put one foot in front of the other, she made a silent promise to the howling wind and the indifferent sky. Hell itself would not stand in her way. Part 3: The Stranger's Light. The mud clung to Leia's skirts like a desperate, drowning hand, heavy and relentless. Her boots, sodden and half-torn from the treacherous journey, had long since ceased to offer any protection from the cold that gnawed at her very bones. Each step was a quiet agony, a monumental test of will that left her gasping for breath beneath the merciless sweep of the rain. Eliza's small weight in her arms, now wrapped in the shawl sling style against her chest, seemed to grow heavier by the minute. The girl, mercifully, had fallen into a fitful, exhausted sleep, her face tucked against Leia's shoulder, her shallow breaths a warm, precious puff against her mother's frozen neck. The storm raged on, a timeless, boundless entity, as though it had been summoned not by the simple mechanics of weather but by some darker, more personal will. Lightning lacerated the sky, casting brief, harsh shadows across the endless expanse of barren fields. The world beyond this churning grey void, the world of sunny days and warm beds, had ceased to exist. There was only this battle between endurance and despair. Leia's eyes, raw and aching from the wind and the strain of searching, scanned the darkness for any sign of shelter, a rock outcropping, a shallow cave, anything. Her pulse pounded a frantic rhythm in her ears, a drumbeat louder than the thunder, louder even than the frantic, clawing hope that refused to die in her chest. She could not let Eliza slip away. Not here. Not like this. And then, she saw it. Movement. At first, she dismissed it as a trick of the storm-addled mind, a shadow cast by the whipping branches of a skeletal tree. But no, there it was again. A figure, tall and lean, striding toward them, moving out of the grey curtain of rain. He moved with a grim, steady purpose, like a man at home in tempests, his shoulders squared against the wind that had so nearly broken her. Leia's breath hitched in her throat. She tightened her grip on Eliza, her heart lurching between terror and a wild, irrational flicker of hope. Should she run? Call out? But her legs were treacherous things now, brittle as frostbitten wood, and she knew with a sickening certainty that she had no strength left to flee. She could only stand her ground, a statue of mud and misery, and wait. The stranger came closer, his outline resolving into clearer focus with each flash of lightning. He wore a long, dark oilskin coat, slick with rain, that fell to his boots. A wide-brimmed hat, pulled low, shielded his face in shadow. In one hand, he carried a lantern, its feeble yellow glow fighting a valiant, lonely battle against the storm's oppressive darkness. He halted a few paces away, the mud squelching under his heavy boots. He raised the lantern, the light catching the rain and making it glitter like a shower of diamonds. He was inspecting them, his gaze methodical and unhurried. Beneath the brim of his hat, his eyes met hers. They were pale, the color of a winter sky, and held a quiet, assessing intelligence. For a long, silent heartbeat, there was only the roar of the storm and the shared, unspoken knowledge of its immense danger. Then he spoke. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together, but it was not unkind. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, stating the obvious as though the truth of it wasn't already carved into every line of her frozen face. Leia found her voice, though it rasped from her raw throat. "We had no choice." The man's gaze dropped to the bundled form of Eliza, whose eyes fluttered open at the sound of his voice. Her lips, tinged with blue from the cold, were barely parted. He saw the child, and something in his posture shifted, a subtle easing of his guarded stance. "Help us," Leia said, the words tearing from her, frayed with a desperation she hated. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. Survival was the only currency that mattered now. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, the man did not answer. The rain sheeted down between them. Thunder roared across the heavens like a dire warning. Leia held her breath, her fate hanging on the decision of this stranger. At last, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Without another word, he moved with surprising quickness. He shrugged off his heavy oilskin coat, the wind immediately plastering his simple shirt to his frame. He stepped forward and draped the coat over Leia's shoulders. It was heavy, smelling of rain, leather, and wood smoke, and it carried the residual warmth of his body. The simple act of kindness was so unexpected, so profound, that Leia felt a fresh wave of tears threaten. "This way," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He turned, expecting her to follow, and plunged back into the storm from which he had emerged. Clutching Eliza closer beneath the vast, borrowed coat, Leia staggered after him. Her legs trembled with each agonizing step, but the man's presence, his quiet confidence, was a lifeline. She did not know who this man was, nor where he might be leading them. He could be a bandit, a madman, or worse. But she understood with a fierce, gut-level clarity that they could not survive much longer alone. His lantern bobbed ahead, a fragile star guiding them through the deluge. He led them up a narrow, rutted path half swallowed by the floodwaters. They crested a low ridge that overlooked a hollow, a small dip in the land sheltered by a stand of ancient, gnarled oaks. Tucked beneath the protective branches of the trees, like a secret held close to the earth's heart, stood a small, sturdy-looking cabin. A thin but steady curl of smoke rose from its stone chimney, a defiant banner against the storm. A warm, welcoming light glowed in its single window. Relief, so sharp and sudden it was like a physical blow, made Leia's knees buckle. She caught herself, her teeth gritted against the overwhelming pull of exhaustion, and pressed on. The man reached the door first. He pushed it open without ceremony and stood aside, holding it against the wind to let them pass. Leia stumbled inside. The air was thick with the scent of burning cedar and something else, something herbal, sharp and medicinal. Heat, real and glorious, wrapped around her like an old, forgotten friend. She crossed the threshold and, on a worn, but clean rug near the stone hearth, she carefully set Eliza down. The child's eyes fluttered shut almost immediately, her lashes spiked with moisture, but her small chest still rose and fell in a fragile, reassuring rhythm. The stranger knelt beside Eliza, his movements efficient and sure. He placed 2 fingers against the side of her neck, checking her pulse, his expression unreadable. Satisfied, he moved swiftly to a rough-hewn shelf and gathered a handful of dried leaves from a clay jar. He dropped them into a steaming kettle that hung over the fire, letting them steep for a moment. "You're a doctor?" Leia asked, her voice hushed, uncertain in the sudden quiet of the cabin. "Of sorts," he replied without looking at her. He poured the fragrant, steaming brew into a battered tin cup, blew on it to cool it, and then, with surprising gentleness, knelt and pressed the rim to Eliza's lips. The girl stirred, her instincts taking over, and she took a few weak sips. A faint touch of color began to bloom in her pale cheeks. Tears of gratitude welled in Leia's eyes, and this time she didn't force them back. They traced hot paths down her cold-chapped cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered, the words wholly inadequate. The man set the cup aside and finally met her gaze, studying her with a quiet, unnerving intensity. Up close, in the firelight, his face was leaner and more weathered than she'd realized. It was marked by old scars, a faint white line that bisected one eyebrow, another that puckered the skin along his jawline. They were scars that spoke of a hard life, a life lived on the ragged edge of survival. Yet, there was no cruelty in him. Only the weary caution of a man who had learned. The wind was a living thing. It came screaming down from the jagged teeth of the mountains, a starving predator, whose howl was the sound of winter's own heartless hunger. It clawed at the farmhouse, its invisible talons tearing at the brittle wooden slats that Henry, with his own 2 hands, had painstakingly nailed into place. This was no mere storm, it was a reckoning. The kind of tempest that ripped fence posts from the frozen earth, as if they were loose teeth, and scoured the very skin raw with its icy breath and payload of grit. Above the vast, unforgiving plains, slate-grey clouds stacked one upon the other, a bruised and heavy ceiling pressing down on the world. The air itself seemed to shiver, charged with a violent, electric tension. The wild prairie, once a boundless sea of golden grass that had whispered promises to Leia on summer evenings, had transformed into a churning battleground of wind, mud, and ice. Inside the small, beleaguered house, Leia Carson clutched her daughter, Eliza, so tightly it was hard to tell where one body ended and the other began. The girl's small frame trembled, a vibration that came not just from the insidious cold seeping through the walls, but from the crackling fear she could feel in the frantic, unsteady rhythm of her mother's heartbeat. Leia's heart was a wild horse, galloping in the tight paddock of her ribs. She pressed her lips to her daughter's temple, tasting the salt of sweat and tears, a bitter communion of their shared terror. Eliza's dark curls, so much like her father's, were damp and plastered against her cheek. "He promised he'd make the walls stronger before winter, Mama," Eliza whispered, her voice a tiny, fragile thing in the roaring chaos. "He promised." "I know, my love. I know," Leia murmured back, her own voice thick with unshed tears. The memory of Henry's promise was a fresh wound. She could see him now, standing right where she was, his brow furrowed in concentration, his hands, calloused and strong, measuring a length of timber. "This house will stand against anything, Leia. For you. For our girl." A lie, as it turned out. The house was failing, and he was gone. Outside, a sound cut through the storm's symphony of destruction, a sound more menacing than any howl of wind, boot heels striking the wooden porch with merciless, rhythmic finality. Leia's blood ran cold. She knew that heavy, unforgiving tread. The door flew open, not from the wind, but from a powerful shove. Amos Granger, her father-in-law, filled the doorway like a thunderhead, a hulking shadow that swallowed the flickering lantern light behind him. His face was a landscape carved from granite, weathered and cracked by decades lived under the harsh western sun. He was a man who saw the world in terms of profit and loss, strength and weakness. There was no room for softness in him, and none dwelt in his eyes now. All Leia could see was a cold, simmering fury that had finally boiled over. "You've brought shame on this house, Leia," Amos said. His voice was not a shout, it was worse. It was a low, splintering sound that cut through the roar of the storm like a shard of ice. "Shame and ruin." Her mouth went dry, a desert of fear. She tried to swallow, but her throat felt as though it had been packed with sand and dust. I never." "Don't you lie to me, girl," he snapped, spitting the word girl like a wad of bitter tobacco. His gaze swept the room, lingering on the small cross she had whittled, the bundle of mountain herbs she had bought from a traveling woman, the last of their coins spent on anything that felt like hope. "Your husband's gone, and you've wasted the last of our coin on foolish hopes. Prayers and trinkets won't fill the silo, and they sure as hell won't bring Henry back." The accusation, so bold and cruel, tore through her like a rusted blade. Henry. Her husband, their son. Buried under a sudden, monstrous avalanche weeks before, his body still lost somewhere in the white-shrouded silence of the mountains. She hadn't wasted their money. She had done the only things she knew how to do. She had paid for prayers at the distant mission. She had hired 2 grizzled prospectors to search for him until the first snows made it impossible. She had bought herbs from a Ute woman who spoke of poultices that could draw life back from the brink of death. It was not foolish hope, it was the desperate, frantic scrabbling of a wife who refused to let go. But Amos had no patience for grief that wasn't his own, and his grief had long ago curdled into blame. Behind Amos, a second figure materialized from the storm-lashed darkness. Martha Granger, her mother-in-law, stood like a pale, skeletal wraith. Her lips, always thin, were now pressed into a cruel, bloodless line. If Amos was the thunder, Martha was the chilling frost that followed, killing everything it touched. Her eyes, small and hard as river stones, offered no kindness, no flicker of shared loss. In her hands, she held a battered carpet bag, stuffed clumsily with Leia's meager belongings. Without a word, without a single glance at the child who was her granddaughter, she dropped the bag onto the muddy, windswept porch. The soft thud was a sound of absolute finality. Eliza whimpered, her small fingers digging into Leia's sleeve like tiny anchors. "Mama, I'm scared." That small, terrified sound was the spark that ignited the last embers of Leia's defiance. She forced her spine straight, a column of sheer will, though her knees threatened to betray her and send her collapsing to the floor. She would not let Eliza see her fall apart. Not here. Not in front of them. "It's going to be all right, baby," she whispered, the words a lie woven from the strongest threads of love she possessed. She met Amos's glare, her own eyes blazing. "This is my home. Henry built it for me. For us." "Henry is dead," Amos growled, the words a hammer blow. "And this land belongs to the Grangers. You're no Granger. You were a distraction, a weakness that got my son killed. He was up in those mountains looking for that damned fool's gold you filled his head with, instead of being here, mending his own roof." It was another lie, a twisting of the truth so profound it stole her breath. Henry had gone looking for a stray calf, a vital piece of their precarious livelihood. The gold was a dream they had shared in whispers, a sweet what-if for a future that would never come. Of fierce determination, a mirror of her mother's, lit her eyes. "I can." Leia's heart ached with a painful mixture of pride and sorrow. This land demanded so much of its children. They made ready quickly. Jonas packed his meager provisions with the quiet efficiency of a man long accustomed to fleeing unseen dangers. He gave Leia a length of rope and showed her how to fashion a more secure sling for Eliza from his spare cloak, freeing Leia's hands. Every moment spent beneath the leaking sky felt like borrowed time. As they stepped outside, the storm's aftermath unfolded around them in a panorama of devastation. The mighty oaks that sheltered the cabin stood firm, but beyond them, lesser trees were bent and broken. Shallow rivers carved new, angry paths across the sodden earth. But the air smelled cleaner, somehow, scrubbed raw and honest, a world washed of its cruelties, if only for a moment. Jonas led them west, his stride sure and steady despite the treacherous footing. He moved through the ravaged landscape with an uncanny familiarity, his gaze flicking to subtle markers. A split stone here, a leaning, lightning-scarred pine there, as if they were old, trusted companions pointing the way. Leia followed in his wake, Eliza a warm, secure weight on her back, grateful for his certainty even as 1,000 questions gnawed at her. After hours of careful, silent progress, They paused beneath the arching branches of an ancient elm that had somehow weathered the storm's fury. Jonas shared water from his flask and tore off strips of tough, dried venison for them to chew. The act was simple, utilitarian, yet it felt almost like a ritual, survival pared down to its barest, most essential elements. "Who are you, really, Jonas Hale?" Leia asked at last, the question bursting from her, unable to be contained any longer. "You don't move like a farmer. You move like a man running from ghosts." Jonas's gaze hardened for a brief moment, his jaw tightening. But when he spoke, his voice held no anger, only a deep, weary resignation. "A man doesn't survive out here unless he learns to outpace his past." "That's not an answer," she pressed, emboldened by their shared ordeal. His lips curled in something that might have been a smile, or perhaps a grimace. "No. It's not." For a heartbeat, she considered letting the matter drop, respecting the walls he had so clearly built around himself. But then she thought of Eliza's fragile breath against her neck, of Amos and Martha Granger casting them into the storm without a shred of mercy. She thought of the unmarked graves that must line these lonely trails, graves of other mothers, other children, who had not been so fortunate as to stumble upon a stranger with a lantern. "You've seen war," she said quietly, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. She had seen that look before, in the eyes of the few men who had returned from the border conflicts, a haunted, hollowed-out look. Jonas's pale, sharp eyes met hers across the small space between them. The silence stretched, and then he gave a slight nod. "I've survived it." There was a world of weight to his words, a depth of experience that needed no further elaboration. And in that moment of shared recognition, that acknowledgement of suffering, something fragile and unspoken began to weave itself between them. It was not trust, not yet. But it was the beginning of understanding. Eliza, sensing the shift in tension, reached out a small, trembling hand from her sling and touched Jonas's scarred wrist. "Did you lose someone?" she asked, her voice soft with the innocent, cutting wisdom of a child. Jonas froze. For a long moment, he did not answer, his gaze fixed on the small hand resting on his arm. Then, with a rough, unsteady breath, he gently covered her hand with his own. His large, calloused fingers were surprisingly tender. "Yes," he said, his voice thick. "I did." No more words were needed. They continued on, the landscape growing wilder and more untamed as the hours passed. Rolling hills rose around them like silent, sleeping sentinels cloaked in mist. The path narrowed to little more than a deer trail, winding through thickets of thorn and bramble. Each step carried them deeper into unknown territory, away from the bitter memories of the farm, and into an uncertain future. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange into the bruised horizon, Jonas slowed and motioned for them to stop. He pointed ahead. Half hidden by a copse of silver birch trees, lay the remnants of an old stone bridge spanning a deep, fast-flowing creek. And beyond it, nestled in a sheltered hollow invisible from the main trail, faint wisps of smoke curled into the twilight sky. "We're close," Jonas murmured, his voice low. Relief and a fresh spike of fear twisted together in Leia's chest. She tightened her hold on the sling's ropes and drew a steadying breath. Whatever waited for them beyond that bridge, it was a fate of their own choosing. Better this than surrendering to the whims of a cruel storm, or the even crueler men who had abandoned them. Jonas led them across the moss-slicked stones of the bridge, his posture weary but unafraid. As they reached the other side, figures began to emerge from the shadows of the trees and from behind makeshift barricades. They were a motley collection of worn, weary souls, men and women draped in patched cloaks, their faces etched with hardship and distrust. They carried no banners, claimed no kingdom, but in their eyes burned the fierce, stubborn spark of survival. A tall woman with a jagged, white scar running from her temple down her cheek stepped forward. Her hair was cropped short, and she held a stout axe resting on her shoulder, as if it were an extension of her own arm. Her gaze was sharp and assessing, raking over Leia and Eliza before settling on Jonas. This had to be Merrick. "You bring strangers, Hale," she said, her tone cool and hard, but not unkind. "Storm still hunting," Jonas replied simply, gesturing back the way they had come. "They need refuge." Merrick considered him for a long moment, her eyes seeming to weigh every word he hadn't said. Then, her gaze fell on Eliza, peeking out from the cloak, and something in the woman's hard expression softened fractionally. She gave a sharp, decisive nod. "They'll have it." A breath Leia hadn't even known she was holding escaped her in a shaky sigh. As they crossed into the camp proper, she felt the crushing weight of fear. An uncertainty began to lift, if only slightly. The camp was larger than she'd expected, a sprawling collection of tents, lean-tos, and a few more permanent-looking structures built into the hillside. A communal fire burned in the center, and the smell of roasting meat and stew hung in the air. People watched them pass, their faces guarded, but no one made a move to stop them. Eliza nestled closer, her eyelids drooping with exhaustion, but her spirit, Leia could feel, was unbroken. Jonas walked beside them, his stride no longer that of a lone, haunted wanderer, but of a man who had found, at least for now, a place to stand. Night crept in, wrapping the hollow in a hush of weary anticipation. Tomorrow would bring new trials, new reckonings. But for the first time since the storm began its assault, Leia felt the slender, powerful thread of hope begin to weave its way back into the tattered fabric of their uncertain future. And she held fast to it with all her might. Part 5: The Reckoning. The cold came before the dawn. It was a different kind of cold than the storm's violent assault. This was a silent, insidious thing, creeping beneath blankets and seeping into bone and marrow alike. It slithered into the heart of the camp, coiling around its weary inhabitants. A delicate lacework of frost glazed the edges of the fire pits, turning the dying embers into pale ghosts of their former warmth. Beneath the pale, hushed light of a pre-dawn sky, the fragile illusion of safety began to fracture. Leia woke to the sound of hushed voices, urgent and clipped. She sat up swiftly, every muscle in her body instantly taut with dread. Eliza still slept beside her under a pile of rough-spun blankets, her cheeks flushed with sleep, her breath a steady, soft rhythm. For a fleeting, precious moment, Leia allowed herself to just watch her daughter, to gather what strength she could from the peaceful sight. Then, a shadow fell over them. Jonas appeared, a dark silhouette against the pearl-grey sky. His face was grim, his eyes dark with something heavier and harder than simple weariness. He crouched beside her, his words low but edged with the sharpness of honed steel. "They are coming." The simplicity of the statement belied the storm of violence it carried. Leia's throat tightened. Amos Granger. It had to be. In some deep, knowing part of her soul, she had understood that safety was a borrowed thing. Men like her father-in-law, men whose pride was as vast and brittle as their land, would not rest easy knowing their quarry still breathed. He would have gathered men, neighbors he could spin a tale to about a thieving, ungrateful daughter-in-law who had fled with his property. How many? She asked, her voice miraculously steady despite the cold dread pooling in her stomach. Enough, Jonas replied, a sliver of bitterness cutting through his usual calm. A scout spotted them before first light. Maybe 20, maybe more. Riding hard. Her breath caught. The number was grim, overwhelming. This camp, this collection of runaways and outcasts, held strength and desperation in equal measure. But desperation was often no match for organized numbers, for steel and fire. Jonas's gaze softened, if only for a heartbeat, as he looked at her. "We can run," he said, his voice a low murmur meant only for her. "There's a trail leading east through the canyons. We can slip out while they hammer at the main gate." Leah looked at Eliza's sleeping form, the fierce, unconditional love for her child warring with a new, unfamiliar hardness that had taken root in her soul. To run meant a lifetime of running. A lifetime of looking over her shoulder, of starting over again and again, of teaching her daughter to live in fear. "No," she answered, the word coming out too swiftly, too firmly, to be mistaken for fear. "We run, we are prey. We are always prey. We stand, we are something else." A flicker of something, respect, perhaps, or a shared, defiant fire, rekindled in Jonas's pale eyes. He gave a single, sharp nod, as though he had expected nothing less from her. As though her answer affirmed something he had seen in her from the very beginning. The camp stirred to life around them, a quiet, purposeful rustle that quickly grew into a hum of activity. Figures moved like shadows in the gloaming, gathering weapons, pitchforks, hunting bows, axes, old swords dull with rust but sharp with purpose. Merrick, the scarred woman, stood on a large rock in the center of the camp, her voice barking orders with ruthless efficiency. "Form ranks at the outer ridge. Archers to the rise. Barricade the southern pass." Her eyes, pale as winter ice, swept over the camp, assessing every man and woman, finally falling on Leah. "If you can fight, you fight. If you can't, you carry the wounded." Leah rose. She gently adjusted Eliza's blankets, then leaned down and kissed her daughter's forehead, a silent promise of protection. She caught Jonas watching her, something unspoken hardening in his expression. "Keep her safe," she told him, her voice thick with emotion. He shook his head slightly. "No. Keep her brave." He pressed something hard and cold into her hand. She looked down. It was a short blade in a worn leather sheath, its edge chipped in places, but recently sharpened. The weight of it in her palm felt both foreign and terrifyingly inevitable. As she strapped it to her belt and joined the ragged line of defenders forming along the ridge, her pulse quickened, not with fear, but with a strange, chilling clarity. She was not the same woman who had stumbled into this camp beneath a storm-drenched sky. Grief and fear had been her companions then. Now, survival had carved her into something sharper, something harder. The dawn broke at last, not with golden splendor, but with the brutal roar of war horns splitting the morning hush. From the tree line beyond the ridge, dark shapes emerged, men on horseback, armored in boiled leather and cruelty, their banners tattered but proud. At their head rode a figure she recognized with a jolt of bone-deep loathing. It wasn't Amos. It was someone worse, a man whose name was whispered in fear across these plains. Captain Bram, a notorious land clearer, a man who worked for wealthy barons, driving homesteaders from their land by any means necessary. He was the architect of her exile, the man Amos must have gone to, trading lies for muscle. Their eyes met across the battlefield. Bram's face, cruel and arrogant, twisted into a vicious sneer of recognition. He remembered the woman from the Granger farm. The land is forfeit. The people are trespassers, he bellowed, his voice carrying over the growing clash of boots and steel. Bring them to heel. The first wave of attackers crashed against the camp's defenses like a tide of shadow and blood. Merrick was at the front, her great axe a silver arc of death, her scarred face locked in a mask of grim determination. Jonas moved beside her like a silent predator, his own blade a blur, striking with lethal, economical precision. Leia fought. She fought with a ferocity she never knew she possessed. Her muscles screamed in protest, but her spirit was an unyielding flame. Every clumsy parry, every desperate thrust of her short blade, became a prayer for Eliza's future. Around her, defenders fell, but others rose to take their place, fueled by a collective fury born not of conquest, but of the simple, powerful desire to exist. An arrow hissed past her cheek, so close it drew a searing line of fire across her skin. She barely flinched. She drove her blade into the thigh of an oncoming soldier, twisting it as he fell screaming, then ducked to evade the retaliatory strike of another. Her movements, once the uncertain motions of a farmer's wife, now carried the brutal grace of necessity. Through the chaos, she saw Jonas take a wound, a jagged cut from a sword across his ribs. He grunted in pain but fought on, his movements only slightly slower, his face a pale mask of concentration. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second across the fray, an unspoken vow passing between them. No surrender. Not now, not ever. Then, amid the din of battle, a sharp cry pierced the air. A cry that was not of war, but of pure terror. Mama! Leia's heart seized. She whirled around to see her daughter, small and defiant, standing at the edge of the central clearing, having been woken by the noise and crept out to find her. A soldier, his face contorted in a savage grin, had broken through the line and was advancing on Eliza, his sword raised. Time fractured. Leia surged forward, every fiber of her being coiled in a desperate, primal scream. But Jonas was faster. He moved with a speed that seemed impossible for a wounded man. He intercepted the soldier, not with his sword, but with his body, crashing into him. His own blade came up in a brutal, efficient arc, driving deep into the man's chest. Blood sprayed across the frozen ground, steam rising from the mortal wound in the cold morning air. Jonas staggered back, weakened by his own injury and the exertion. He fell to one knee, clutching his bleeding side. Leia reached them, her breath coming in ragged, painful sobs. She pulled Eliza into a fierce embrace, her hands trembling as she checked her for injury. Jonas met her gaze, pain flickering across his pale features. "Get her to Merrick," he rasped, his voice tight. "Now?" But Leia shook her head, her decision absolute. "Not without you." Another wave of attackers crested the ridge, their war cries ripping through the dawn. The camp's defenders faltered, their line buckling under the sheer weight of the assault. Merrick's voice rang out above the chaos, strained but unbroken. "Hold the line. Hold the line, you sons of bitches." Desperation gave Leia a strength she did not know she possessed. With Jonas leaning heavily against her for support, she half carried, half dragged him toward the center of the camp, where Merrick and the last of the fighters were making their final, desperate stand. Eliza clung to her mother's side, her eyes wide with terror, but her small mouth set in a determined line. She was unafraid. She was brave. "They are not done," Jonas warned, his breath shallow and wet. "Neither are we," Leia answered, her voice a raw growl. Together, they rallied beneath Merrick's command. Flames began to lick at the edges of the camp as torches were hurled over the barricades. Smoke coiled into the sky, a black banner of defiance against the gray heavens. Leia fought beside Jonas, guarding his wounded side, her blade finding flesh, her heart refusing to yield. Then, through the haze of battle and smoke, a new horn sounded. A deep, unfamiliar note that seemed to reverberate not just in the air, but through the very marrow of the earth itself. The attackers hesitated, faltering mid-charge, their expressions confused. From beyond the ridge, from the west, fresh figures emerged. They were not Bram's men. They were allies. Hunters, trappers, other wanderers and outcasts drawn by the smoke and the sound of defiance. Ragtag and unarmored though they were, they descended upon the invaders' exposed flank with a merciless, wild precision, turning the tide of the battle in a heartbeat. Captain Bram's sneer of victory twisted into a mask of disbelief as his forces crumbled around him. He turned to flee, but Merrick, seizing the moment, lunged forward. With a final, triumphant roar, she drove her great axe deep into his chest, ending his tyranny with brutal, bloody finality. The battlefield fell silent, the abrupt quiet more shocking than the noise had been. The only sounds were the crackle of burning wood and the labored, gasping breaths of the survivors. Leia stood amidst the wreckage, Eliza pressed tightly to her side, Jonas leaning heavily against her shoulder. Around them, the camp was scarred and battered, but it was unbroken. Merrick approached, blood staining her blade, her clothes, her very skin. Her eyes, hard and bright, met Leia's. "You fought well," she said, the words a rare and precious flicker of respect in her tone. "We fought," Leia replied, her gaze sweeping over the fallen and the living alike. "For our lives. For each other." Jonas managed a grim, bloody smile, his teeth stained red. "And we won." In the ruin of the dawn, beneath a sky smudged with smoke and the first, tentative rays of hope, they stood together. Not as outcasts. Not as prey. They were something fiercer now. Survivors. Fighters. A family bound not by blood, but by the shared crucible of fire and fury, and the hard-won promise of a future carved from the wreckage of the past. And as the sun clawed its way above the horizon, gilding the broken, blood-soaked earth with a clean, new light, Leia knew that the reckoning was not an end. It was only the beginning.